Good morning and welcome to the September 2020 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, could you please introduce our agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, commissioners. For today's meeting, you will hear 7 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order that will remove the existing non-federal allocations from the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band as an important step toward making 100 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.4 to 3.55 gigahertz band available for commercial use, including 5G, throughout the contiguous United States. The Commission will also consider a further notice of proposed rulemaking that will propose to add a co-primary non-federal fixed and mobile, except aeronautical mobile, allocation to the 3.4 to 3.55 gigahertz band, as well as service, technical, and competitive bidding rules for flexible use licenses in the band. Second, you will consider a 6th report and order that would expand access to and investment in the 4.9 gigahertz band by providing states the opportunity to lease this spectrum to commercial entities, electric utilities, and others for public safety and non-public safety purposes. The Commission also will consider a 7th further notice of proposed rulemaking that would propose a new set of licensing rules and seek comment on ways to further facilitate access to and investment in the band. Third, you will consider a report and order that would improve the timeliness and transparency of the process by which the Commission seeks the views of executive branch agencies on any national security, law enforcement, foreign policy, and trade policy concerns related to certain applications filed with the Commission. Fourth, you will consider a notice of inquiry that would seek comment on ways to dissuade states and territories from diverting fees collected for 911 to other purposes. Fifth, you will consider a report and order that would modernize requirements for notices cable operators must provide to subscribers and local franchising authorities. Sixth, you will consider a report and order on reconsideration, and further notice of proposed rulemaking that would set compensation rates for Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone Service, IPCTS, deny reconsideration of previously set IPCTS compensation rates, and propose service quality and performance measurement standards for captioned telephone services. Seventh, you will consider an enforcement action. This is your agenda for today. Please note item 4, entitled Promoting Caller ID Authentication to Combat Spoofed Robocalls, and item 7, entitled Eliminating Records Requirements for Cable Operator Interests in Video Programming, as listed in the September 2020 Open Meeting Sunshine Notice, have already been adopted by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first item, entitled Facilitating Shared Use in the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band, will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chief Stockdale, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, and the Office of Economics and Analytics are pleased to present for your consideration a report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking on facilitating shared use in the 3100 to 3550 megahertz band. John Markman, an attorney in the Mobility Division of the Wireless Bureau, will present this item. John?
Thank you, Don, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking presented for your consideration today is the next step in opening up additional mid-band spectrum for wireless broadband and, ultimately, allowing full power commercial wireless access to the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band throughout the contiguous United States. It is part of an effort across the federal government to make more mid-band spectrum available for broadband services such as 5G, while protecting access for critical federal systems, including military radar. Today, federal radio location services operate on a primary basis in the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band, as do federal aeronautical radio navigation services in the 3.5 to 3.55 gigahertz band. The 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band is also allocated to non-federal radio location operations on a secondary basis and to non-federal amateur operations in the 3.3 to 3.5 gigahertz band. In the Mobile Now Act, Congress instructed NTIA to work with the Commission to examine the feasibility of sharing the broader 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band between federal users, primarily the Department of Defense, and commercial wireless operations. In the Commission's December 2019 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, we proposed to remove the secondary non-federal allocations from the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band. Alongside NTIA's analysis, efforts by the Department of Defense, the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Commission most recently identified the 100 megahertz at 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz for sharing between federal operations and commercial wireless services on a co-primary basis. In order to implement this sharing, the report and order would revise the table of allocations to remove the secondary, non-federal radio location and amateur allocations for the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band. The report and order would relocate non-federal radio location licensees to the 2.9 to 3.0 gigahertz band and afford amateur licensees the flexibility to choose their own alternate spectrum. These operations would be required to vacate the band on a future date certain based on when new flexible use licenses are issued in the band. The further notice of proposed rulemaking would propose to reallocate the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band for non-federal, fixed and mobile, except aeronautical mobile, services on a co-primary basis with federal services. It also would propose and seek comment on technical, licensing, and competitive bidding rules for the new band, as well as on the nature of sharing between commercial wireless users and incumbent federal operations. Specifically, based on coordination with NTIA and the Department of Defense, it would seek comment on permitting full-power commercial operations across the entire 100 megahertz throughout the contiguous United States, but would establish specific areas in which federal use would continue in certain situations. These situations would be tailored to minimize limitations on commercial operations while still enabling important federal uses to continue. The further notice also would seek comment on the process for relocating non-federal secondary radio location operations out of the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band and into the 2.9 to 3.0 gigahertz band, and on sunsetting amateur operations in the 3.3 to 3.5 gigahertz band in a way that fully protects new commercial wireless services while allowing amateur operations to continue where they will not interfere with those new wireless broadband services. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, and the Office of Economics and Analytics recommend adoption of this item and request editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
And thank you for that presentation. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to the item, I want to briefly discuss two unrelated but pertinent points. First of all, I've truly enjoyed my time at the Commission and have been incredibly humbled by the opportunity to serve our great country. The fact of the matter is my time at service is coming to an end, regardless of the November presidential election. While there has been some speculation over whether I would return to the Commission under certain circumstances, I do not seek for anyone to pursue my continued service at the Commission beyond my current term, which will conclude at its appropriate point sometime later this year. Second, regarding today's meeting, I want to truly thank Chairman Pai for building a September open meeting agenda so packed with items for which I have led the charge. With 5 of the 7 items being directly a culmination of my efforts over the Commission, some of these things are just going back to my earliest days. I'm truly appreciative. So let's get into it. Walking into the Commission almost 7 years ago, I was intent, some may say hell-bent, on securing sufficient spectrum for next-generation commercial wireless services. I knew it wasn't going to be an easy project, but a challenging one that needed to be tackled head-on. Spectrum battles were common on the Hill, so I knew what I was getting into. But I recognized then, as I do now, the future of American wireless innovation and connectivity depends on delivering more and more commercial spectrum to market, no matter the Herculean effort required. It is a simple but essential point and has been foundational to my mission to produce the requisite spectrum resources for both licensed and unlicensed offerings. While I was heavily involved in allocating millimeter wave spectrum for 5G, which was the focus during the Wheeler Commission, I also spent my time and energy laying the groundwork for mid-band spectrum, having determined years ago that it was going to be the centerpiece of these future networks. I'm proud of my efforts led to the recent introduction of unlicensed opportunities in the 6 gigahertz band and to a 5.9 gigahertz order, which hopefully will be on the horizon. But it's time to produce more spectrum for exclusive use to complement my work on the 3.5 priority access licenses and the C-band spectrum to be auctioned later this year. Simply put, the time has come to turn another of my priorities, repurposing 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz from federal government to private sector use. Thankfully, we take appropriate steps today to affirmatively increase spectrum utilization in the 3.1 to 3.5 gigahertz band by freeing the upper 100 megahertz for commercial high-power mobile and fixed wireless systems, while clearing the band of and reallocating some current non-federal users, such as radio location and amateur services, is important and worthwhile. The more consequential effort is to implement the agreement reached between the White House and the Department of Defense on this key spectrum band. It has been clear for some time that although these frequencies are crucial for 5G and other innovative wireless offerings, it was going to be very difficult to get DoD to finally surrender this slice of spectrum. It's the sole reason why I wrote a letter to President Trump in April imploring him to provide assistance in repurposing at least 100 megahertz for commercial use. Some laughed and others even ridiculed my letter, but I have to say I'm fairly pleased with its results. I appreciate the momentous effort the President Trump administration, especially Larry Kudlow and his team, for their perseverance in reaching acceptable terms with DoD and supporting a private sector-led 5G commercial effort. I've been assured that the deal struck between the White House and DoD will substantially clear this 100 megahertz for private sector wireless licenses, but that may take some time to relocate some of the military operations currently in the band. Well, DoD has not yet released its transition plan, meaning some details are set to be disclosed later. There is enough information in the record to initiate this rulemaking process. Expediting the release of this first 100 megahertz is a great start towards meeting the 300 to 500 megahertz of mid-band spectrum experts estimate will be required in the very near future. On that note, I'm frequently asked whether this spectrum, along with the additional bands, is truly needed when the 3.5 gigahertz and the 280 megahertz of C-band spectrum starting at 3.7 gigahertz are available. The answer is a resounding yes. Wireless providers are ideally seeking 100 megahertz blocks, and the demand doesn't stop there. Don't forget, cable providers are actively seeking wireless opportunities. Industrial uses and other private networks are being deployed, and the Internet of Things will require extensive network connectivity. And that's just a handful of plausible uses and services. Not to mention, we need to ensure that there are spectrum resources for future technology generations. Make no mistake, the spectrum pipeline cannot be left empty. For these reasons, we need to seriously consider the remainder of the band, starting with the 100 megahertz or the 3.35 to 3.45 gigahertz. I appreciate my suggestion to direct Commission staff to work with federal agencies on making this spectrum available for exclusive use licenses was incorporated to the order, and that we seek comment in the NPRM on how to get this done. These frequencies must be cleared, and the remainder of the band should be studied for potential sharing opportunities. The spectrum resources and others will be needed to maintain our global leadership in wireless innovation and broadband technologies in near and long term. I hope the Commission will continue to exert significant pressure towards these ends and even take whatever proverbial incoming arrows are required to enable as much commercial use as possible in this band and others. And I will approve the item, and I thank the chair.
Thank you. And before I turn the floor over to Commissioner Carr, I just want to say, Commissioner O'Reilly, that you have served at the Commission with great honor and distinction. I appreciate your leadership to advance the public interest on everything from CBRS, the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, to KidVid, leadership at CTEL to fee diversion, a wide variety of issues. I'm proud to call you a colleague and even prouder to call you a friend. Thank you for your service to the country. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, I want to echo everything that the chairman just said, and appreciate and congratulate Mike on his service to the country. Really appreciate it. Turning to the item in front of us, a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of being in Defiance, Ohio, with its representative, Congressman Bob Latta. Congressman Latta invited me out to see live 5G in a rural part of his district. A local WISP there was experiencing a surge in internet traffic as parents and kids stayed home to work and learn through the pandemic. Using mid-band spectrum and 5G radios, the provider expanded coverage, increased capacity, and even gave school kids free Wi-Fi access. Defiance was showcasing one of the leading services in 5G's first wave, in-home broadband. In fact, the first 5G customers in the world were a Houston couple who accessed one provider's millimeter wave 5G to power a gigabit home connection. The high speeds and low latency of millimeter wave 5G make it a competitor to even fiber connections. I can tell you from my travels that giving families another choice for in-home broadband is wildly popular. Now, 5G isn't limited to high-band in-home service, of course, but by the end of this year, in fact, all three national carriers will have turned on low-band 5G across much of the country. And that will give us 5G nearly everywhere and elevate what our phones and hotspots can do, whether from a skyscraper or a country road. Mid-band will give us capabilities and coverage in between. Anticipation of this flavor of 5G has been building for quite some time now. This reflects the long runway it takes to get a new technology off the ground. For example, look no further than this item. More than 2 years ago in the Mobile Now Act, Congress instructed NTIA and the Commission to study freeing up the lower 3 gigahertz for commercial use. Our examination showed that the upper 100 megahertz of that spectrum were most ready for 5G. And today we begin the process of moving the band towards fairly clear, flexible use. Because of the actions this commission has taken, in mid-band in particular, 5G anticipation will be over for millions of Americans, perhaps in a matter of weeks. If the online reports are true, and I'm just reading those online reports, not breaking any news, Apple may announce its first 5G iPhone next month. That would mean that before the holidays, millions of Americans could finally have a phone in their hand that runs on 5G. Providers have been building full tilt in anticipation of this great shift to 5G. And with any luck, a great number of people will get to see hundreds of megabits per second on the move for themselves. And this could kick off a virtuous cycle of upgraded handsets that feed demand for new apps and use cases, that feeds investment in more network upgrades, that feeds the cycle again. Even as mid-band 5G takes off in the coming weeks, there's much more runway for us to keep building at the Commission. America's demand for data never stops, and wireless companies will need a steady supply of fresh spectrum to serve their customers. That's why day in and day out, the work of the Wireless Bureau and all of the Commission staff is so important and deserves our thanks. So their work in this item have my support. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this item forward and all the work that we've been able to get done to deliver more mid-band spectrum. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Well, at the outset, I want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues regarding Commissioner O'Reilly or Mike. It has been an honor to be your colleague, and I'm prouder still to be your friend. So with that, I will turn to what's before us. I have faith that the United States can lead the world in the next generation of wireless technology. But that conviction is not the same thing as destiny. We will lead if we plan. Now, on that front, I think we have work to do. It was 2 years ago that we first saw an executive order entitled Presidential Memorandum on Developing a Sustainable Spectrum Strategy for America's Future. It boldly called for a new national spectrum policy. But that plan was due more than a year ago. and it still doesn't exist. That's a shame, because in its place, this agency is doing what it can with the authority it has. But it is becoming increasingly clear that different parts of our government are pulling in different directions when it comes to spectrum policy. We've had too many noisy disputes to count, with this agency pursuing one course and others, including the Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, and Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, pushing in public to pursue another. Plus, on matters of equipment security, we have had public disputes between the Attorney General and the National Economic Council about the best path forward. Needless to say, a 5G plan requires a whole of government approach. We should be working together in the same direction. And that brings me to the effort we begin in earnest today. In this decision, the FCC removes the non-federal radio location and amateur allocations in the 3.3 to 3.5 gigahertz bands. In addition, the agency seeks comment on a plan to make the top 100 megahertz in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band available for commercial use. This is good news because the United States is behind other countries in mid-band spectrum availability, and quick delivery of these airwaves could help us close that gap. But I fear here we go again, because there's still no government-wide plan. The White House and the Department of Defense have teamed up to develop what is being called America's Mid-Band Initiative Team, or AMBIT. The AMBIT initiative helped clear the way for our work in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band today, and this is good. But less than a week after the FCC offered its proposal for these airwaves, the Department of Defense started its own proceeding. It issued a request for information regarding the construction of a 5G communications network for itself, using a portion of the very same spectrum we are looking at for expanding commercial use. Stand back and you see that we have competing proceedings, and this is not good. All of this means that we are heading into our wireless future with something less than a fully coordinated effort. We don't have a national strategy in place for 5G, and we badly need one. Coordination matters, not just for the big picture. We also need to think in a coordinated way about the band before us now, so we don't end up increasing interference and decreasing our utility of limited mid-band resources. Here's what I mean. Today's rulemaking seeks comment on making 100 megahertz of new mid-band spectrum available for high-power 5G use. But we need to be mindful that new operations in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band could hinder success in the adjacent citizens broadband radio service. For example, we need to understand if federal operations that are vacating the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band are going to relocate to the CBRS band. If so, this would have consequences for ongoing commercial use of CBRS spectrum, because federal users have a preemptive right in these airwaves. This would be an unfortunate outcome, especially when you consider that licensees collectively just spent more than $4.5 billion to purchase CBRS spectrum at auction. But we lack information here about what relocation of federal users may look like. Here's another coordination issue. Under the approach the FCC adopts today, the Department of Defense has identified a number of areas that it calls periodic use areas. These are locations where it anticipates that from time to time it will need to access some or all of the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band. But unlike the CBRS band, this use will not be managed dynamically. So that creates real uncertainty for commercial users. While we seek comment on how spectrum coordination with the Department of Defense would work, history suggests this could be problematic. It sounds a lot like what happened with our framework for the 37 gigahertz band, when at the 11th hour, the FCC and Department of Commerce offered seemingly conflicting versions about how coordination would work. Finally, coordination should compel us to consider a forward-thinking, holistic approach to the entire 3 gigahertz band. Remember that we have proceedings in the near past, present, and future involving the 3.45 gigahertz band, the 3.5 gigahertz band, and 3.7 gigahertz band. We should consider how viewing these airwaves together could maximize their use. To this end, we should take a long look at what we learned in CBRS about spectrum auctions, license sizes, and sharing, rather than reflexively reverting back to same old, same old. In light of these concerns about coordination, I appreciate that my colleagues have agreed to my request to include additional questions in the rulemaking about how to best protect our recent success in CBRS. and how we can create less uncertainty and more spectrum opportunity in the 3.45 gigahertz band. With these questions in mind, I approve today's effort. But I also hope we can find a way to align our efforts with others in the government, because when we plan together and work together, our spectrum future is stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Well, I'll start, of course, as well with a congratulations and a thanks as well for your service, of course, Mike. And so many items have had your thought leadership and have been animated by you, but you and I have a shared experience as well with kids that are about the same age. And so I'll cherish our conversations either on your couch or on mine about a lot of those things and working and dadding at the same time. So to the item, mid-band spectrum is critical to our broadband future, but it's nearly impossible to identify bands that aren't occupied by existing users with ongoing operations. In many cases, these existing users are federal agencies with mission-critical uses, and that's why the Commission works closely with those agencies to institute sharing arrangements that will protect existing operations while allowing non-federal use. And this item is a good step towards expanding available mid-band spectrum. It implements our decision from last year and relocates existing secondary non-federal users from the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz portion of the band, setting the stage for new entrants and new uses. Next, it proposes a sharing regime between non-federal licensees and federal users that will free up 100 megahertz of mid-band airwaves for license exclusive use across most of the country while protecting critical federal operations. I'm glad my colleagues accepted edits from me seeking comment on an alternative approach that would incorporate aspects of our 3.5 gigahertz band rules, including license areas, power levels, opportunistic use. Only last month, our auction of these priority access licenses in that band closed after raising nearly $4.58 billion in bids. The auction not only made available the largest number of FCC spectrum licenses ever, but set a record for the number of bidders, something I think is important, more than 270. The number and variety of new licensees, coupled with the unlicensed use already underway in the band, promise to make the 3.5 gigahertz band a source of tremendous innovation and opportunity. It therefore makes sense to consider whether a similar approach might work in the adjacent 3.45 gigahertz band, and I look forward to reviewing those comments. And like many, I've been deeply puzzled by the continued talk by the Defense Department creating a nationwide 5G network for shared military and civilian use, potentially even involving the spectrum discussed in this proceeding right here. And despite repeated rebukes, this idea continues to surface, providing yet another example of how this administration simply can't get on the same page on these telecom issues. This is not a close call, and this is not an idea that I expect will bear fruit. More broadly, in the last 2 years, our agency has repeatedly received contradictory, confusing messages from the White House and executive branch agencies on a number of these issues: 24 gigahertz, 5.9, the L-band, and even the potential for use of open RAN networks. We should exercise the FCC's authority by moving forward as quickly as possible in this proceeding and working with our federal partners to free up additional spectrum in the lower 3 gigahertz and other bands. Thank you to the Bureau for their hard work on this proceeding. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. Most of you have probably heard the old adage that good things come in threes. And when it comes to the FCC's efforts to make critical mid-band spectrum available for 5G services, good things are happening in threes with respect to spectrum in the range of 3 gigahertz. First, our recently concluded auction of priority access licenses in the 3.5 gigahertz band was a rousing success. A total of 228 bidders in that auction won 20,625 licenses for spectrum between 3550 and 3650 megahertz, raising over $4.53 billion in net bids in the process. The 70 megahertz of spectrum offered in this auction is part of the larger 150 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz band that we have made available for licensed and licensed by rule use under an innovative three-tiered dynamic sharing framework. Second, we are on track to begin an auction of 280 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band on December 8th. This C-band auction will make a wide swath of mid-band spectrum available for 5G on an expedited time frame due to all incumbent satellite operators in that band electing to relocate on an accelerated basis. And third, today we are making major steps toward freeing up 100 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band for 5G. Last December, this commission proposed removing existing non-federal secondary allocations from the 3.3 to 3.55 gigahertz band and relocating those operations to other frequencies to ready all or a portion of this band for next generation wireless services such as 5G. We took this initial step to further the aims of the Mobile Now Act, which required the executive branch to explore sharing of the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band between federal operations and commercial wireless services. Today, a mere 9 months later, we adopt our proposal to eliminate these secondary non-federal allocations. We relocate existing non-federal radio location licensees to the 2.9 to 3.0 gigahertz portion of the S-band, where they can continue to operate on a secondary basis. Amateur licensees have a variety of additional spectrum bands allocated for this service and can choose the alternative that works best for their particular operations. And we allow incumbent radio location and amateur licensees to continue to operate in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz segment of the band as we complete this rulemaking. Moreover, thanks in no small part to the hard work of stakeholders, commission staff, the White House, the Department of Defense, and NTIA, we also propose to make the 100 megahertz of spectrum between 3.45 and 3.55 gigahertz available for flexible use wireless services throughout the contiguous United States. Specifically, we propose to add a co-primary, non-federal, fixed and mobile, except aeronautical mobile, allocation to the band. We seek comment on coordination requirements between federal incumbents and new commercial flexible use licensees, including the adoption of limited cooperative planning and periodic use areas. We propose service, technical, and competitive bidding rules for licenses in the band. Our action today, in tandem with continued work by the Department of Defense and other federal partners, puts us on course to auction the spectrum next year. And when combined with our other efforts regarding 3 gigahertz spectrum, this will result in 530 megahertz of contiguous mid-band spectrum being made available for 5G and other next generation services. One might say that good things are coming in threes in the threes. Our work here on making available this band and other spectrum bands is the direct result of incredible effort by the FCC staff, to whom I offer my sincere gratitude. I want to say my thanks to the staff of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities for working so hard, so fast to get us to this point today. This item has my full support. And with that, we will move to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks again to the staff for their hard work. And Madam Secretary, can you please take us to item number 2 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will also be presented by the Wireless Telecommunication Bureau and is entitled Expanding Access to and Investment in the 4.9 gigahertz band. Once again, Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
All right, Mr. Stockdale, you were so good the first time, we brought you back for the sequel. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, next, Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau are pleased to present for your consideration a 6th report and order and 7th further notice of proposed rulemaking on the amendment of Part 90 of the Commission's rules to make changes to how the 4.9 gigahertz band is regulated and used. Nellie Fusner, an attorney in the Mobility Division of WTB, will present the item. Nellie?
Thank you, Mr. Stockdale. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The report and order presented for your consideration today would adopt a voluntary leasing framework for the 4.9 gigahertz band to expand use of and investment in the band while preserving public safety access. Currently, 4.9 gigahertz licensees share the band without exclusivity and can only use their spectrum in support of public safety. Each licensee has access to the full 50 megahertz, and licenses may overlap where a city, county, and/or state hold licenses in the same area. Coordination to prevent interference occurs on an informal basis. Despite efforts by the Commission to increase use of the band, it has remained underutilized for almost 20 years, particularly outside of major urban areas. If the Commission adopts this report and order, the 50 megahertz of mid-band spectrum will be made available for potential secondary markets opportunities across the country, particularly in suburban and rural areas where public safety use is far more limited. The report and order would expand access to the band by giving eligible states the opportunity to lease some or all of their 4.9 gigahertz spectrum rights to other entities, including commercial wireless operators, critical infrastructure, or public safety entities. Those states would also have the ability to designate a single statewide 4.9 gigahertz licensee as a state lessor. The report and order would also permit the state lessor to engage in non-public safety operations, entitling it to the same usage rights as its lessees. The further notice of proposed rulemaking would propose a new set of licensing rules that would make permanent the structure of the application freeze imposed by the bureaus on September 8th, 2020. We propose grandfathering existing public safety licenses as of the date of the freeze, while prohibiting modifications that would expand operations. Going forward, the item proposes limiting the issuance of new 4.9 gigahertz licenses to state entities in states without an existing statewide license. The further notice would also seek comment on a new framework for 4.9 gigahertz spectrum access through a voluntary state band manager, which would coordinate and authorize new public safety operations in the band within its jurisdiction. The FNPRM would seek comment on future treatment of states that are currently ineligible to participate in the new leasing framework, as well as states that might become ineligible in the future. Finally, the further notice would seek comment on additional ways to implement and facilitate robust use of the leasing framework adopted in the 4.9 gigahertz band, including the use of dynamic spectrum sharing and coordination across jurisdictions. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau recommend adoption of this item and request editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fisner, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The underlying premise of the item before us is incredibly sound. The 4.9 gigahertz band is vastly underutilized, and not just by a little bit. Seeking to produce greater efficiency and increase the uses of 50 megahertz of spectrum at a time when its premium for spectrum is at an all-time high shouldn't be controversial. And this scarcity is precisely why the Commission must take action as soon as possible, not only on this band and the 3.1 to 3.5 gigahertz band, but also on 5.9 gigahertz band. Well, I certainly respect and support our public safety officials and truly appreciate all that they do to protect our communities. No commission should let spectrum essentially lay fallow based on the notion that someday the allocation just might possibly be used widely for its intended purposes. The messages of we intend to use it for certain conditions if certain conditions are met or it will be needed someday are no longer credible or sufficient. For years, I've discussed the 4.9 gigahertz band and its relationship to the Spectrum Act of 2012, T-band, and the 911 fee diversion. Finally, Congress and the Commission are aligned in attempting to resolve some of these residual issues through their respective processes. My first action when this item was circulated was to request a reversal of course and seek first full commercialization of the band while protecting existing incumbent systems. That is consistent with my approach to the NPRM and is driven by the fact that every expert admits the U.S. must free more spectrum to meet the demand for future commercial wireless services. While this spectrum may not be ideal for 5G on its own, it has been identified by the wireless industry as a very good candidate for that purpose if the Commission takes certain actions. Sadly, my request didn't win the day with my colleagues. Compelled to pivot, I tried to live within the rather, let's say, interesting approach taken in the item. I do have some concerns that this will just create another EBS-like mess, kicking the can down the road, forcing a future commission to revisit the whole structure. It is not entirely clear how or whether it will work at all as proposed. There is also the distinct possibility that this item won't necessarily solve anything, but instead may even prolong uncertainty. I'm able to support the item, however, because at the very least, it moves away from the status quo towards somewhat improved usage and commercialization of the band. Moreover, the modified version excludes states that are diverting 911 fees to other purposes from reaping any benefits from this spectrum largesse, such as New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and certain counties in Nevada. These states have proven themselves untrustworthy when it comes to managing precious consumer-paid fees. A bit later on today's agenda, we will consider an NOI that will hopefully result in the Commission dealing with these issues in a holistic manner. But here, we can immediately lock in righteous policy change that ensures current diverters will pay a price for their malfeasance, while seeking comment on a broader approach, including how to treat diverting states in the future. The leasing fees and other benefits contained in this item may be, in fact, modest compared to the diverting dollars, helping to explain the lengths at which some states will go to continue this practice. But the current item will take a tangible step, probably my last, to rectify the injustice of fee diversion. In the end, we will just have to wait and see if any of the item's structure gains traction or survives future policymakers' second guessing. Having extensive experience on these matters, I'm a bit skeptical that that will be the case. For the reasons discussed above, I approve, and I thank the chairman for working with me to ensure wrongdoing states are not unjustly enriched. And I thank you so very much. And to get to Mr. Stark's point, I do have a little one with me, so if I'm diverted at all, I apologize, or you see my eyes go off to attention. So thanks so very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Hey, at least you're only diverting attention and not fees, Commissioner. Thank you for that. Commissioner Card.
Thanks much. For nearly 2 decades, the FCC has designated this 50 megahertz swath of spectrum for public safety use. And yet, after all this time, by our count, only about 2% of eligible public safety entities have become licensees. There are many causes for this underinvestment. Availability and cost of equipment, scale, and an inefficient sharing regime are just a few. So today we set out to fix the problems for the benefit of state and public safety officials alike. We do so by empowering local leaders, not those of us sitting here in Washington, to determine the highest and best use of this spectrum based on those officials' own assessments of local needs. They can keep using this spectrum for public safety, and in fact do so more efficiently due to the new rules we put in place, or they can lease these airwaves and use the revenue that's generated to fund public safety or other mission-critical initiatives. They have the choice, and I trust them to make the right call for their communities. The men and women who protect us, who put out fires, race to us in ambulances, and answer our emergency calls, they've taken the brunt of this pandemic more than most. They don't get to socially distance. Their help is needed more right now, yet they're often given less. If there ever were a time for our agency to give public safety a hand, to get rid of some old rules, to open up a path for funding, now would be that time. So we take that step today and empower our country's local leaders to determine how best to use this spectrum. I want to thank the Wireless Bureau and the Public Safety Bureau for their hard work on this item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
This decision is unfortunate. It is not the right way forward for the 4.9 gigahertz band. It is a slapdash effort to try to foster use of this spectrum by giving states the right to divert public safety communications in exchange for revenue. This approach has virtually no support in the record. However, it does have opposition from a wide range of stakeholders, from wireless carriers to public safety officials. So what makes such a diverse crew unite in opposition? Well, it takes a little background to understand. At its core, this proceeding involving the 4.9 gigahertz band features an all too frequent dilemma in modern spectrum policy. We have airwaves that are the subject of older allocations and lots of arguments about underutilization. At the same time, we have newcomers looking for new ways to put them into operation. So it is here where for nearly 2 decades, 90,000 public safety entities have been eligible to obtain licenses in the 4.9 gigahertz band. However, relatively few have done so. That's because there is a limited vendor ecosystem supporting this band, so it is hard to acquire equipment and it's costly to deploy it. As a result, for the past few years, the FCC has sought comment on how to help public safety make use of these airwaves and what more can be done to encourage a robust market for equipment. So far, so good. But now fast forward to the present. In this decision, we abandon this course and decide that these airwaves no longer need to support public safety. We clear the way to kick first responders off this spectrum and then cede this agency's authority over the band to state licensees who will be empowered to lease these airwaves to third parties to generate revenue. This adds up to a reduction in public safety communications with a more fragmented market for equipment and a 5G future with a whole bunch of the same problems we had with leases in the 2.5 gigahertz band that, remember, we went to great efforts to dismantle in the not so distant past. What a mess. It didn't have to be this way. There's a reason so many entities have come together to oppose this reorganization of the 4.9 gigahertz band. And if you're keeping score, that includes the Public Safety Spectrum Alliance, the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association, APCO International, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Major Cities Chiefs Association, the Major Counties Sheriffs of America, the Metropolitan Fire Chiefs Association, the National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians, the National Association of State EMS Officials, the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council, the National Sheriffs Association, and the Western Fire Chiefs Association, among others. They're on to something. Today's effort to remake the 4.9 gigahertz band misses the mark. In fact, there are 3 things that are fundamentally wrong with the leasing framework the agency adopts today. First, today's decision threatens to do long-term damage to public safety communications. Now that's a shame because it's never been more apparent how much communications matters for first responders. Right now, they are on call for assistance for a devastating pandemic, raging wildfires, seasonal hurricanes, and more. By breaking up this band into a patchwork of state leases, we will further fragment the equipment market, raise costs, and decrease the likelihood of interoperable communications. That's not good. For 2 decades, since 9/11, it has been government policy to increase opportunities for interoperability for first responders. That's because on that fateful day when emergency personnel from all over came together, they couldn't communicate with one another because each jurisdiction had its own communications protocols. We have 20 years of work to remedy this problem. It is unfortunate that today's decision not only reverses this trend, it could set us back. Second, today's decision borrows stale leasing policies from the past that make it much harder for reform in the future. The nearby 2.5 gigahertz band offers a cautionary tale. Nearly 6 decades ago, the FCC allocated the 2.5 gigahertz band for educational use, but many licensees had difficulty making full use of their spectrum. So over time, the FCC permitted educational licensees to lease excess capacity for commercial use. Sound familiar? Over time, more than 90% of the available spectrum was leased for commercial use, and many licensees began using these airwaves as a proxy for revenue instead of a resource for education. The original public purpose behind the allocation was lost. There's no reason to think states won't do the same here and override public safety investments made at the county and local levels in the process. And there's no reason to think that the same policies that failed to fix the 2.5 gigahertz band will magically fix the 4.9 gigahertz band. Third, today's decision will not encourage new investment in the band. This approach will only fragment these airwaves on a state-by-state basis. There will be no consistent and reliable information about what spectrum is available where or how it is being used, making it difficult, if not impossible, for wireless service providers to plan or invest in deployments. Taken together, these problems demonstrate that this framework is not an especially thoughtful solution for optimizing the 4.9 gigahertz band. This is regrettable, and I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our public safety organizations face some of the most difficult circumstances in living memory. Millions of Americans have taken to the streets to protest for justice. Throughout California and the Pacific Northwest, crews are battling devastating wildfires, tropical storms, and hurricanes this season have ravaged certain regions in the United States. And of course, COVID-19 has claimed more than 200,000 lives so far this year, and there are still 3 more months to go in the year. That's the context for today's decision, and at a time when our public safety organizations are stretched to their limit and their communication needs are increasing, this commission is adopting with no notice and comment an approach that I think is not only unwanted, but runs contrary to years of public safety spectrum policy. For nearly 20 years, the commission has struggled to make efficient use of the 4.9 band. And at first glance, the band does look like a prime candidate for reallocation because of its apparent underutilization and mid-band location. But according to the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council, the band contains almost 4,000 incumbent fixed public safety sites and over 2,000 geographic licenses, each of which entitles the licensee to use the full 50 megahertz of 4.9 throughout its entire jurisdiction. In addition, while the 4.9 band is mid-band, it's far from a prime candidate for 5G in the United States. Indeed, the countries that are most actively using this band are Russia and China, and the major telecom equipment manufacturer there is Huawei. We should not be surprised. In contrast to our other mid-band spectrum proceedings, we've received far less interest from commercial wireless users and providers. Moreover, today's decision pursues an approach that comes out of the blue. Since this proceeding first began, the FCC has considered many different options to increase spectrum usage in the 4.9 band while protecting critical public safety operations. It's black letter law that agencies must provide notice and an opportunity to comment before adopting a rule. But at no point have we proposed effectively delegating the Commission's spectrum authority over to the band to state governments. I already had serious concerns about the draft order circulated under the APA. And if the original draft put us over the edge, the current one drives us off the cliff. The final report and order now disqualifies states from participating in the state lesser model if they engage in 911 fee diversion, a concept that is framed for debate in another item here today. This proceeding has not sought comment on that issue or anything like it. And there is no way that commenting parties, and including the state governments, public safety organizations, citizens that will be adversely impacted would have reasonably known to comment on the idea. This approach is, in my mind, facially deficient as a matter of administrative law. And beyond these procedural flaws, this decision is likely to have serious policy consequences. By pushing management of 4.9 to the states, the majority risks creating dozens of inconsistent approaches to this valuable spectrum resources. States have vastly different interests and levels of spectrum expertise and will undoubtedly take different approaches on issues like interoperability, security, and interference protection. As a result, public safety usage of this 4.9 band may actually become less efficient, less secure, and less reliable, even with commercial interests meager at best. I do recognize that this band presents a difficult challenge, but I wish that we had withdrawn this item and worked on more fully addressing the public safety community's concerns. This is not the moment to take chances with critical public safety spectrum. I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. In 2015, a report from a task force of the Association of Public Safety Communications Officials, or APCO, determined that, and I quote, the 4.9 gigahertz band represents a valuable, though currently underutilized resource. This situation came to pass because of significant problems with the regulatory framework for the band. The Commission's rules put this spectrum in a silo, which led to a limited amount of niche, expensive equipment that was available for use in the band. The story of the 4.9 gigahertz band became one of spectrum haves, primarily in large cities such as New York City, Los Angeles, and Seattle, and have-nots, namely the 96.5% of potential licensees that have not obtained licenses for 4.9 gigahertz spectrum, particularly the smaller and rural jurisdictions that cannot afford to deploy in that band. You heard that right. Less than 1 in 25 potential licensees has obtained a license to the spectrum. Less than 1 in 25 uses this critical public resource. Well, half a decade later, this unacceptable state of affairs persists. The 4.9 gigahertz band remains valuable spectrum, and it remains underused and in regulatory limbo. To maximize the value of this public resource for the American people, today we revise our rules by empowering eligible states to put the 4.9 gigahertz band to its highest and best uses. We will harness the power of our secondary markets framework to create leasing opportunities for statewide entities in states that do not divert 911 fees for non-911 purposes. Under our new approach, we will allow a single state government entity to lease covered spectrum in this band while maintaining and protecting incumbent public safety licensees' operations. We recognize the simple truth that what works in New York City may not make sense in rural West Virginia. Therefore, we give lessors the right to choose what is best for the citizens of their state. They can enter into leases with public safety and non-public safety entities alike. If an eligible state wants to lease its spectrum to FirstNet for use in its nationwide public safety broadband network, it can do that. If it wants to lease the spectrum to a commercial entity to use for deploying a dedicated public safety broadband network, it can do that. If the state wants to lease spectrum in less densely populated areas to a wireless internet service provider, an electric utility, or another critical infrastructure industry, or a mix of all three, and retain the spectrum in more densely populated areas, it can do that too. This last point bears emphasizing. Utilities and critical infrastructure industry entities have argued that opening this band to them would not only help them fulfill their public service obligations, but also help develop a broader equipment ecosystem that will help current public safety licensees and address one of the primary problems facing the band. Moreover, some of the equipment WISPs use today to provide fixed wireless service in the uni-bands may be easily tunable to 4.9 gigahertz band frequencies, allowing these providers to quickly deploy inexpensive, commercial, off-the-shelf equipment to rural and underserved areas to help bridge the digital divide. In fact, some public safety entities have indicated that they already use unlicensed equipment operating in the neighboring 5 gigahertz band because that equipment is so much less expensive than current 4.9 gigahertz band equipment. The approach we adopt today may not be perfect, but it's better than any of the alternatives that have been proposed. And one thing we know for sure is that regulatory inertia is not the best option. The 4.9 gigahertz band is well suited to meet this nation's growing demand for mid-band spectrum. And this commission will not stand idly by and let the spectrum continue to largely lie fallow. Leasing arrangements will create significant opportunities for commercial access while protecting incumbent public safety operations and generating substantial potential revenues that states can use to strengthen public safety services. Our flexible, forward-thinking framework represents the most viable path for making this public resource an actual resource for the American public. And I'm pleased that this approach is supported by forward-thinking groups that believe this spectrum should be put to its highest and best use, groups that span the political spectrum, like the Taxpayer Protection Alliance, New America's Open Technology Institute, the Washington Policy Center, and the Pelican Center for Technology and Innovation. I want to offer my thanks to the staff that worked on this item from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. This item has my full support. With that, we'll move to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel? Commissioner Rosenworcel, are you there? I see a frozen screen. Commissioner Starks?
I dissent, Mr. Chairman.
The chair votes to approve.
If it's helpful, I believe Commissioner Rosenworcel said she was going to dissent in her statement, but you know, I defer to what is proper protocol here.
We have the advisors who are actually available to vote the item.
Oh, terrific. Okay. If Commissioner Rosenworcel's advisor could vote by proxy on her behalf. We'll tell you what. Why don't we already have a majority in support of the item? We'll construe the item as adopted, but when Commissioner Rosenworcel gets back online, I will turn to her to formally record her vote. Obviously, her statement suggested she'd be dissenting, but we'll just record that for the records going forward. So the item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thank you again to the staff, to Ms. Fusner for the presentation. And Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the International Bureau and is entitled Improving Transparency and Timeliness of Foreign Ownership Review Process. Thomas Sullivan, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Sullivan, good to see you. The floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The International Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration this draft report and order addressing the process used by the Commission for seeking executive branch guidance on potential national security, law enforcement, trade, and foreign policy concerns raised by FCC applications with foreign ownership. The genesis of this order occurred several years ago when International Bureau alum Diane Cornell headed up the Commission's process reform efforts and identified one area of particular concern to her, seeking to establish firm timeframes for executive branch review of foreign ownership issues. She personally worked closely with the team in the Bureau, the commissioners, industry, and our counterparts in the executive branch to find solutions. These efforts resulted in the Commission adopting in 2016 a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that would establish timeframes and improve the foreign ownership review process. I would like to acknowledge the contributions on this item from staff in the International Bureau, including Troy Tanner, Kate Collins, Denise Coca, Francis Gutierrez, David Kretsch, Artie Lechtman, Samita Makati, Leah Kim, and Jenna Fatah, as well as our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, Enforcement Bureau, Media Bureau, Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Wireline Competition Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of Communication Business Opportunities. I would now like to introduce Leah Kim, an attorney advisor in the Telecommunications and Analysis Division, who will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This report and order would adopt rules and procedures to improve the timeliness and transparency of the process by which the Commission coordinates with the executive branch review of certain FCC applications with foreign ownership. For over 20 years, the Commission has routinely referred these applications to a subset of executive branch agencies informally known as Team Telecom for assessment of any national security, law enforcement, foreign policy, and trade policy concerns. The executive branch review process, however, can add several months, if not years in some cases, to the processing time to otherwise streamline FCC proceedings. To add greater regulatory certainty and transparency to this process, the Commission staff have worked with the executive branch and industry to improve the ability of the executive branch agencies to expeditiously and efficiently complete their review. One key development in this area is the President's April 4th, 2020 Executive Order Number 13913 that establishes timeframes for review and replaces Team Telecom with the Committee for the Assessment of Foreign Participation in the United States Telecommunications Services Sector. Building upon the executive order, the report and order before you provides additional steps to streamline the review process. For instance, the report and order clarifies the types of applications the Commission will continue to refer to the executive branch, and within these types of applications adopts 4 categories of exclusions for applications that generally will not be referred. It establishes a 120-day timeframe for initial review, and if necessary, a 90-day secondary assessment period for executive branch agencies consistent with the executive order. The report and order also requires all international Section 214 and submarine cable applicants with or without foreign ownership, as well as all Section 310B petitioners to make certain certifications to not only help protect national security and law enforcement interests, but also to assist the Commission in its ongoing regulatory obligations. In addition, to speed up the review process, The report and order requires applicants with reportable foreign ownership to file responses to a standardized set of national security and law enforcement questions directly with the committee prior to or at the same time as they file their applications with the Commission. To further improve and facilitate a more streamlined review process, the report and order adopts other changes, such as requiring the committee to provide notifications to the Commission on the status of its review for each referred application. The International Bureau recommends adoption of this report and order and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kim, for that presentation. Two quick housekeeping notes. Thanks in part to Mr. Sullivan putting us over the edge. I've now been shamed into putting on a tie. Thank you for that, Mr. Sullivan, Commissioner Starks, and Commissioner Carr. But secondly, and much more importantly, Commissioner Rosenworcel is back with us. Glad to see you. And if we could just return to the previous item, if you don't mind recording your vote just for posterity. I know it's been voted in E-class, but we would appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. We already had problems in my house with multiple kids going to online school and a spouse who's working as well. So sorry about that. But I will dissent on the framework for the 4.9 gigahertz band. And thank you for taking the time to request that.
Absolutely. Good to see you again. With that, we will turn to comments on the current item, Team Telecom item from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little over 5 years ago, I wrote about the need to improve the opaque executive branch review process for certain commission applications involving foreign ownership, commonly known as Team Telecom. Ever since, I've been urging the reforms to provide transparency and certainty for affected applicants and licensees trapped in this regulatory black hole, not knowing what concerns executive agencies have, how long the review will last, and who they can talk to about getting their application out of the morass. Working with former Chairman Wheeler, my efforts culminated in a proceeding to improve the Team Telecom process, which after many conversations with affected agencies was approaching the finish line when, without explanation, someone slammed on the brakes just hours after the 2016 election. Under current procedures, the Commission welcomes the advice of relevant federal agencies, and while we could act alone in certain situations, it's wise to allow the experts to have a say. America's national security and law enforcement agencies are in a much better position to analyze the multitude of threats facing the United States, and that they have a legitimate role to play in this process. Thus, preserving the current framework and goals while fixing any existing problems is in everyone's interest. We must give all due credit to the Trump administration for crafting and approving an executive order to do just that. Ultimately, the executive order revamps Team Telecom with a fairly sound structure and operating process by setting frameworks for application review, increasing accountability by placing one department in the lead position, expressly excluding review of transactions that do not directly affect the control of a company, and insisting that a simple contact number be provided. Among other fixes, the executive order improves the process enormously. That is not to suggest that the executive order is perfect. Certainly, there are things I would have done differently, such as including a more definitive and objective standard for starting the review clock, shortening the review periods even more, and limiting the ability of the new committee to review previous decisions. In this vein, the Commission is taking steps to rectify some of these concerns. For example, by ensuring that those entities whose foreign ownership is being re-reviewed will be afforded due process and an opportunity to respond. Additionally, I'm pleased that my requested edit to finalize the list of standardized questions within 90 days was accepted. By answering these questions and submitting them to the committee prior to filling their FCC and filing their FCC application, applicants will expedite the start of the review period. Other rules we are adopting, such as providing 30 days for the committee to send tailored questions to the applicant, will also help speed the process along. Despite some suggested tweaks, let's be clear, the basic structure provided by this item will go a long way in ensuring applicants that they get the answer within a reasonable time frame. This is a clear victory for both national security and government efficiency, and I will approve the item. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. As Commissioner O'Reilly laid out, the national security and law enforcement agencies play a critical role in helping to secure America's telecom infrastructure, both within their own sphere, and by feeding back a lot of their guidance and recommendations to the FCC as we engage in our own efforts. And I think that collaboration has played out very well over the last few years, particularly if you look at the steps that we've taken at the FCC to secure our networks, in particular from the threats posed by entities that may be controlled by communist China. And we've taken those steps from Huawei to ZTE to China Mobile, and we're going to continue those efforts. And the order we're voting on today will significantly improve the Team Telecom process by promoting greater transparency and certainty, as Commissioner O'Reilly explained. It reflects years of hard work and countless staff hours across multiple administrations, agencies, and departments. It also builds on the executive order that President Trump issued earlier this year. And in all of this, our steps reaffirm our commitment that we are going to do whatever it takes to secure America's communications networks from those that would seek to do us harm. So I want to thank the International Bureau for their work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
For more than 2 decades, a collection of executive branch authorities, informally known as Team Telecom, has been responsible for national security decisions concerning telecommunications assets. In practice, this meant if a transaction was proposed that featured foreign interests, it was Team Telecom that called the shots. Likewise, if there were ownership questions about foreign facilities, Team Telecom would take the lead in any government. So here's a bit of radical candor. I worked for the former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and recall finding the arrangement really opaque. I now serve as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission, and I still find this process less than. For years, it has had no statutory basis and no governing rules. But this is changing. In April, an executive order was released entitled Establishing the Committee for the Assessment of Foreign Participation in the United States Telecommunications Service Sector. It formalizes Team Telecom and seeks to make clear what for too long has been murky about the National Security Review. Is long overdue. And today the FCC takes its own steps to update our rules consistent with this order. I believe these changes, which include strict timeframes and increased clarity about just which applications will be referred to this committee, will improve national security review. They also add much needed transparency to the process. These changes recognize that the integrity of the United States telecommunications networks is vital to our national security. In other words, national security and network security go hand in hand. But we make a mistake if we stop here. In June, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which is part of the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, released a report reviewing the extent of foreign telecommunications companies operating in the United States. It memorializes past deficiencies with the Team Telecom and FCC review process. Now, while some of these problems are remedied going forward by the executive order and our action here, there's a lot more we can do. In particular, the report criticized Team Telecom and the FCC because for nearly 20 years, neither has monitored foreign-owned carriers after they were authorized to provide service to the United States. And that's not acceptable. National security risks are constantly evolving. It's not enough to formalize a process for reviewing new foreign ownership at a single point in time. The FCC must continue to monitor and engage with carriers once they are authorized to operate in the United States. To this end, I'm pleased that we have begun reviews of 4 companies that are ultimately subject to ownership and control of a foreign government. And that includes China Telecom Americas, China Unicom Americas, Pacific Networks, and ComNet. We should complete these national security reviews as soon as possible. Then we should establish a clear standard and process for revoking a foreign carrier's existing authorizations on national security grounds. Right now, we don't have one. I think our hands are unnecessarily tied when it comes to national security. We also should require periodic review and renewal of a foreign carrier's FCC authorizations. While the recent executive order allows executive branch agencies to review existing authorizations, it doesn't require it, and it envisions no role for the FCC. We should take the initiative and change that so that the agency can continually account for evolving risks. I hope we can pursue these additional reforms soon, because our efforts today represent progress, but it has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're adopting these rules to govern our coordination with the executive branch on applications potentially impacting national security and law enforcement. These procedures will formalize our coordination process with Team Telecom so we can work more effectively to protect national security while providing predictability and timely feedback to applicants on their proposals. Communications networks have become even more essential to our national security because of the critical nature of the internet and because adversary states and criminals continue their attempts to tamper with, block, or illegally access our communications. And while the Commission has been rightfully focused on removing threats within the U.S. network, whether through foreign-made equipment or via authorizations to operate within the United States, I again call attention to one critical aspect of modern communications that is also subject to the Commission's oversight, and that is the international carriage of traffic between the United States and the rest of the world via undersea cables. Far below the surface of the ocean, 99% of the world's internet traffic travels through about 300 fiber optic cables, about the width of a garden hose. The first undersea cable transmission was a telegraph message between the US and the UK 3 years before the Civil War. Back in those days, it took more than 2 minutes to transmit a single character. The latest undersea cables will transmit 250 terabits per second, fast enough to send everything in the Library of Congress to Europe 3 times every second. These cables have been important to international communications for a really long time, but the internet has made them essential. And earlier this year, we saw the catastrophic effect of an undersea cable that was cut in Yemen, when the loss of one single cable reduced the entire country's internet capacity by 80%. Cloud computing allows us to store our data in remote servers around the world, and undersea cables allow us to access those servers wherever we're located. And that's why an increasing number of cables are owned by tech companies, as opposed to traditional communications companies. Companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon now own or lease nearly half of the world's undersea bandwidth. Because these cables are so important, we must ensure that adversary countries and other hostile actors can't tamper with, block, or intercept the communications they carry. And that's why I express concern about the Pacific Light Cable Network, which was proposed by 2 American tech firms and a Chinese partner that would have connected landing sites between Los Angeles and Hong Kong. Team Telecom shared my concerns, stating that if the project was granted with the Hong Kong connection, quote, U.S. customers may soon have little choice but to let their traffic flow through Hong Kong in order to reach final destinations in other parts of Asia, close quote. And that such a cable, quote, landing in Hong Kong would provide additional opportunities for Chinese government authorities to collect U.S. communications traffic for further big data analysis, close quote. This summer, the applicants withdrew their application for that Hong Kong connection, and just a few weeks ago, another pair of American tech companies and a Chinese partner withdrew their application on the San Francisco and Hong Kong connection as part of the Bay-to-Bay Express cable system. The concerns here are not just about the landing sites of the cables, but who owns and operates them. Even though PLCN will no longer connect through Hong Kong, it's still owned in part by a Chinese company that has been convicted of bribing Chinese government officials, and that built a surveillance network for Beijing police. In its opposition to the PLCN, Team Telecom raised additional concerns about this company's compliance with the FCC's transfer and control requirements, as well as the Chinese government connections with the company that will operate the undersea cable. And the Chinese partner for the Bay-to-Bay cable system remains none other than China Mobile, whose application to operate in the United States was denied by this commission, of course, last year. It does not stop there. One of the largest undersea cable companies in the world is Huawei Marine, which has built or repaired almost a quarter of the world's cables. This includes upgrades to a major submarine cable connecting the US and Canada, as well as cable connecting New York City and London. Huawei Marine was sold to another Chinese company last year. And as one official has explained, undersea cable laying is a business, but it is also a battlefield. Clearly, undersea cables are a critical national security asset. The FCC must work with our partners holistically, and including Team Telecom, to treat them accordingly. We must take a closer look at cables with landing locations in adversary countries, and this includes the 4 existing submarine cables connecting the US and China, most of which are partially owned by Chinese state-controlled and owned companies. One of these cables received FCC approval just 3 years ago. And while undersea cable connections between the US and China are appropriate, the Commission must work with Team Telecom to ensure that these communications are secure. New cables are essential to our economic and technological future, but they too must be secure. Because of their greater capacity and speed, these new cables will likely become the least expensive option for our communications. There is much more work to be done here. And as I previously stated, the Commission should issue a public notice forming a national security inter-bureau task force. The Commission currently reviews a broad swath of these national security issues on a distributed basis, and we need to have a better collected approach. This distributed structure makes internal coordination challenging and risks inconsistent treatment of national security issues between the bureaus. These issues will only happen more often as our world becomes more interconnected. We must be more intentional than ever that the FCC is wholly coordinated, deliberative, and collaborative. Finally, the Commission should work with Congress and the executive branch to examine whether our authority over these cables should be updated. The Commission's authority to grant undersea cable landing licenses is pursuant to a delegation of authority from the President under a statute that predates the Communications Act by over 13 years. We're talking about nearly 100 years old authority. Given that the issues surrounding these cables will also become more complex, more intertwined with our national security, we should take a close look on whether our regulatory authority is sufficient to meet the moment. Thank you to IB for their important work on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Today marks a critical milestone regarding foreign involvement in the U.S. telecommunications sector. We are reforming the Team Telecom process. That is, the process by which the executive branch offers its views on applications and petitions to the FCC involving foreign ownership. In so doing, we formalize the close working relationship across our agencies on this matter and offer much needed clarity to the private sector on the rules of the road. The importance of this topic is driven in part by the importance of the communications sector to our nation's economy. The United States benefits immensely from both foreign and domestic investment in our communications sector. Worldwide spending on information and communications technology is estimated to reach $4.3 trillion in 2020, according to one study. This raises potentially competing interests. On one hand, we want to seize the opportunities that an influx of capital and talent can afford, such as stronger research and development, more innovation, better services, domestic job creation, and economic growth. On the other hand, we also need to take into account the serious national security, law enforcement, foreign policy, and trade policy issues that such an influx can present in some circumstances. To properly address these interests, we need an approach that allows us to identify and expedite beneficial foreign investment, but block or place appropriate remedial conditions on foreign investment that threatens our nation's interests. And we rely on input from expert executive branch agencies to help us do that, to help us ensure that the FCC has the information we need in order to make the appropriate judgment. When we initiated this proceeding in 2016, I called the current foreign ownership review process broken, and it was. Among other things, the review process often has taken too long and lacked basic transparency. But the good news is that today, working together with the executive branch, we are fixing it. Earlier this year, the President signed Executive Order 13913, which established a new committee for the assessment of foreign participation in the United States telecommunications services sector, and streamlined the process by which executive branch agencies review applications for international Section 214 authorizations and petitions for foreign ownership rulings under Section 310B of the Communications Act, among other applications. Today, we revise our own procedures to complement the framework set forth in the executive order. Our actions will provide greater regulatory certainty to stakeholders, will promote beneficial foreign investment in our telecommunications industry, and better protect U.S. national security, law enforcement, foreign policy, and trade policy interests. Under our new rules, we will require parties to furnish executive branch agencies with responses to a set of standardized national security and law enforcement questions designed to provide the agencies with the information they need from applicants to facilitate their review. We will also require applicants to certify that they will comply with FCC rules. We'll designate a U.S. citizen or permanent resident as a point of contact for lawful requests and legal service of process. We'll maintain the accuracy and completeness of applications or petitions, among other things. These ex-ante requirements will create clear expectations for applicants. We'll incentivize prompt and thorough submissions to the executive branch during the review process. And as a result, will enable those agencies to more quickly and efficiently complete their work. These new rules will also expedite the review process. Consistent with the executive order, we adopt a 120-day initial review period for applications that we refer to the executive branch, with a possible 90-day extension for a secondary assessment in limited circumstances. Under our new timetables, most executive branch reviews should be completed within 127 days from the date the committee determines an application is complete, as compared to the average time of 260 days for commission action on applications reviewed and cleared by Team Telecom during calendar years 2016 to 2019. In short, our actions today will provide for a more efficient and effective review of foreign ownership applications. It will also improve our teamwork by aligning the Commission's rules with the reforms adopted by the executive branch earlier this year. And they will help us strike the right balance, encouraging beneficial foreign investment and ownership in the U.S. communications sector, while limiting or even barring transactions that could impair the national interest. It would not have been possible for us to reform the Team Telecom process without the dedication of many, many people within this agency. I first want to thank Commissioner O'Reilly for his work to draw attention to a topic that many years ago wasn't getting the attention that it merited. And I also want to thank an interdisciplinary group from across the agency for the work on the item, led, of course, by the International Bureau, who we have heard from today, and also the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank all those in the executive branch who have worked for many years on Team Telecom reform and whose efforts resulted in the executive order that helped pave the way for this order today that we're voting on. Speaking of, we will now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve, and thank you to Chief Sullivan for increasing the clothing and professionalism of our chairman here.
I will take the chair's prerogative to rule that an ad hominem attack outside of the scope of our deliberations, Commissioner, but point noted nonetheless. It's anyway, the chair, I forgot where I was. The chairman must approve as well, and the item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. And notwithstanding Commissioner Stark's comment, Chief Sullivan, thank you, and Ms. Kim for the work on this, and all of your colleagues in IB. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item is entitled Combating 911 Fee Diversion. The item will be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Given the rash of injuries among Philadelphia Eagles receivers, I'm glad to see, Ms. Folks, that you've not been dragged to Philadelphia to serve on the team. You're still in your current position. The floor is yours.
Now, see, Mr. Chairman, you had to go there. You just had to go there, but that's okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I asked you not to go there, but you decided to go there anyway. Okay. Good day, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Adequate funding is critical to ensure that the nation's 911 system can continue to provide Americans with the life-saving services they rely on in times of crisis. Despite the vital importance of funding for 911 services, some states divert 911 fees collected from residents to non-911 purposes. We know this, and we know this because the Commission reports annually to Congress on state 911 fee collections and expenditures. And each year, for the past 11 years, we have identified a number of states as diverters, and a few of those states are repeat offenders. I'm just going to say it straight. This is unacceptable. 911 fee diversion potentially puts lives at risk. In the draft notice of inquiry we present to you today, we explore and seek comment on whether the Commission could take additional steps to help end 911 fee diversion once and for all. With me today from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau is Brenda Boykin, an attorney advisor in the Policy and Licensing Division. I would also like to thank David Firth, Erica Olson, Michael Wilhelm, John Evanoff, and Jill Coogan for their work on this item, as well as the other bureaus and offices that contributed. Ms. Boykin, you know what to do.
Thank you, Chief Folks. Good afternoon, Chairman Pai and Commissioners. In its latest annual report to Congress on the collection and distribution of 911 fees and charges, the Commission found that some states and jurisdictions have diverted over $1 billion to non-911 purposes between 2012 and 2018 alone. With today's notice of inquiry, the Commission would begin a closer examination of 911 fee diversion. The draft notice seeks information on the harm that fee diversion causes and on potential ways to dissuade states from continuing this practice. The draft notice asks whether restricting federal 911 grant funding for diverting states has been effective in deterring fee diversion, and whether such approaches could be used in programs administered by the Commission. The draft notice also solicits comment on regulatory steps the Commission could take to discourage fee diversion, such as limiting the availability of Commission licenses to jurisdictions that engage in fee diversion, or using the Commission's Truth in Billing authority to increase consumer awareness of fee diversion in states that engage in it. Finally, the draft notice asks whether the FCC could improve its annual reporting process or provide additional guidance on what constitutes fee diversion, among other things. The Bureau recommends adoption of this notice of inquiry and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boykin, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning appropriately with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is no question that consumers expect states to use 911 fees only for purposes directly related to the building and operating of 911 systems, and not for filling state coffers, stealing the money, and diverting funds towards other projects and programs unrelated to essential 911 services. No matter how meritorious that other spending may be in a few limited cases, we all know that funding is naturally fungible. State taxes and other fees are available. These state diverters could otherwise cut spending elsewhere or raise taxes to meet their funding needs for their non-911 programs. What is unconscionable, even shameful, is that certain states hide behind labels like public safety to dupe consumers and shortchange 911 calls and cajoling. These states simply refuse to change their diverting ways. And unfortunately, the preliminary review of calendar 2019 data suggests that 4 states are likely to remain unapologetically on the list: New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Nevada. In New York, I heard firsthand how local property taxes had to be increased at the county level to pay for 911 call answering centers to make up for the huge shortfalls in funds sent by the New York state government. Similar stories can be told of other states. Despite these few remaining outliers, it is worth noting that the vast majority of states have taken steps over the last decade to rectify their behavior and remove their names from this odious list. While we have had some success shrinking the number of diverters, more work remains. This undertaking has been one of my top priorities during my time at the Commission, and I thank the Chairman and the dedicated staff for finalizing today's notice of inquiry, which is an effort to explore every creative idea and tactic the Commission can use under its existing authority to end these diversions once and for all. Diverters are already statutorily barred from receiving federal Next-Gen 911 grants, and I expect the Congress may need to provide even stronger statutory tools for the Commission to finally address the remaining diverters and put and prevent horrendous practice in the future. In any case, I'm heartened by the overwhelming support for the reform shown in Congress as recently as last week and throughout the Commission, and I'm hopeful that today's NOI will continue the positive momentum needed to finish the project and reduce the number of diverters to zero. I also want to thank Chairman Pai and Commissioner Rosenworcel for joining me on this crusade for supporting broader efforts over the years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now turn to Commissioner Carr.
I want to say first and foremost, obviously, hats off to Commissioner O'Reilly for his leadership. He spotted this issue years ago and has been working diligently to help address this. You know, he has this shame campaign, as I call it, that has called out bad actors, and he has brought many of them to heel, and that's delivering some results, and that's great. And now, with his backing, the Commission is moving forward with an NOI, look at some additional tools that may be necessary to fully get the job done that he's worked so hard on. And I mean, obviously, all of us have spent a lot of time with public safety officials and 911 call centers, and we understand the resources that it takes to really get this done. And it is truly a shame that some of those resources that are, identified and needed are being diverted. Just a couple weeks ago, I was down in Orlando at a 911 call center. They get something like 70,000 911 calls a month, and that cannot be done if funding is being diverted for other purposes. And I've been on the opposite extreme from Florida, up in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle on the Arctic Ocean in Wainwright, Alaska, and met with public safety officials there. They don't quite get 70,000 calls a month there, but the ones that they do are important. So really want to emphasize again Commissioner O'Reilly's leadership on that, and glad that we're pressing forward with this item. So thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now turn to Commissioner Rosenworcel.
You know, as the old saying goes, you may only call 911 once in your life, but it will be the most important call you ever make. And, chances are when you make that call, you won't put much thought into the system that's behind it. So I think we should take a moment to praise the people behind our 911 system and recognize the folks who keep us connected when the unthinkable occurs. So to do that, I want to tell you a little story. It starts with a woman named Betty Wafer. You see, I first saw her in action at the 911 call center in Dallas, Texas. She was born and raised in the Big D, and she knows the city inside and out. It really makes a difference because when people cry out for help, she has a sense of just how to deploy that assistance in the city she loves and has always called home. And over the course of 3 decades, she rose to the top of its public safety ranks, and today she is in charge of all 911 communications for the Dallas Police Department. There is not a lot that Betty Wafer hasn't seen. Like a lot of the people who work on the 911 front lines, she has a preternatural calm. After all, these are the people who listen to us when we are at our most troubled and then ensure that help is on the way. And as we walked through her call center, and this was years ago, she spoke with authority about how technology has changed, how essential it was to be able to keep up, and how important it was to ensure that funding for 911 makes it to its intended destination. I was so inspired by that trip that actually the two of us partnered to write an editorial that was published over 4 years ago. We wrote about the need for a national funding plan for 911, and tops on our list was ending 911 fee diversion. It's not acceptable when states allow a line item on communications bills that expressly say it's for 911, but then turn around and send those fees elsewhere. It was the very first time anyone from this agency had ever written on this subject. I then testified before Congress about it. And later I shared the pen with Commissioner O'Reilly, who shares my concern about this practice and deserves credit for pressing this issue in a big way. I'm glad to see that some of the ideas we put forward, including efforts to incentivize fee diverting states to do the right things, are included in today's notice of inquiry. It also asks appropriate questions about the boundaries of this agency's authority and seeks ideas regarding steps we can take to improve our annual fee diversion reports and put the pressure on to end this ugly practice altogether. The way I see it, all good ideas are welcome. They can make a meaningful difference across the country as we navigate the transition to next generation 911. And they are especially important for states wrestling with funding challenges in the here and now that have been brought on by this pandemic. And they matter for our nation's 911 operators like Betty Wafer and the thousands of others who run our 911 centers across the country. They deserve the support intended for them. Fee diversion needs to stop. I fully support this inquiry, and I look forward to the record that will develop.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now turn to Commissioner Starks.
Yes, thank you. No statement from me, but I will approve the item, and thanks to all for the hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll make a statement on my own behalf. In 2020, we have been reminded many times of the life-saving work that our first responders have done across the country. There's still 3 months left in the year, of course, but it seems like we've already had enough disasters to last a lifetime, from the COVID-19 pandemic to raging wildfires in the West, from hurricanes Laura and Sally to the Iowa derecho. But whenever disaster strikes, and we know it will, our first responders have answered the call, and they've put their lives on the line to serve the American people. And more times than not, that call has come through the nation's 911 system. And that is why it is so important that our 911 system receive the funding that it needs. And that's why it is outrageous, unacceptable, as Chief Folks aptly put it, that some money earmarked for 911 is being diverted for other purposes. Indeed, our latest annual report to Congress on states' collection and use of 911 fees found that between 2012 and 2018, states diverted over $1.275 billion with a B in fees collected for 911 services to non-911 purposes. I will be even blunter than Chief Folks. 911 fee diversion is fraud. The government takes money from consumers with the promise that it'll be spent on improving our nation's 911 system, and it spends it on something else. And this fraudulent practice has real life consequences. 911 fee diversion makes it harder for legacy 911 systems to transition, to upgrade to next generation IP-enabled emergency networks. It makes it harder for 911 dispatchers to do their jobs, and it jeopardizes the safety of the American people. The practice of 911 fee diversion must stop, and today's notice of inquiry is an important step toward achieving that goal. We seek comment on the effects of 911 fee diversion and explore additional steps the FCC and/or others could take to discourage states from diverting 911 fees. We're examining all options, such as placing restrictions on grant funding, conditioning state eligibility for FCC licenses, and leveraging our Truth in Billing Authority to address the description of 911 fees on consumer bills when diversion occurs. Now, of course, as we have heard from our colleagues, the problem of the 911 fee diversion is not new. And thanks to the leadership of FCC Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, this problem in recent years has been getting the scrutiny that it deserves. Indeed, just last week, the U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly approved legislation by a 410-5 vote that would, among other things, help prevent 911 fee diversion by states and other taxing jurisdictions by requiring the FCC to establish rules specifying acceptable purposes and functions for which 911 fees may be used. With today's notice of inquiry, we're continuing to do our part to address the problem of 911 fee diversion. And if we can find a way to end this practice once and for all, we will improve our nation's 911 system, keep Americans safe, and do the right thing by America's first responders. And so for their hard work, I would like to thank the dedicated staff of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel. This item has my full support. With that, we'll move to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Card?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted. The editorial privilege is granted as requested. Thanks to Chief Folks and Ms. Boykin again for the presentation and the hard work. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fifth item is entitled Modernizing Cable Service Change Notifications, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative. The item will be presented by the Media Bureau, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Ms. Carey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Media Bureau presents what, if adopted, will be the 25th order as part of the Commission's Media Modernization Initiative. This item primarily updates the Commission's rules concerning the notices that cable operators must provide subscribers and local franchising authorities in the context of program carriage and retransmission consent negotiations. John Cobb from the Media Bureau's Policy Division will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this report and order that revises the Commission's rules regarding the notices that cable operators provide to subscribers when there is a change in a channel lineup due to a failed retransmission consent or program carriage negotiation within the last 30 days of a contract. The notices cable operators must provide to local franchising authorities about service and rate changes, and notice of changes to the information contained in annual notices that cable operators must provide subscribers. In today's video marketplace, retransmission consent and program carriage negotiations are often concluded within days, if not hours, of the expiration of existing agreements. And in those cases, it is frequently unclear, 30 days prior to a contract's expiration, whether there will be a new agreement, whether a new agreement will be reached, whether there will be a short-term extension, or whether programming will be dropped. This report and order amends the consumer notice rules to clarify that when service changes occur due to retransmission consent or program carriage negotiations that fail within the last 30 days of a contract, cable operators must provide notice to subscribers as soon as possible, rather than 30 days in advance. This change will ensure that consumers do not receive inaccurate or premature notices about potential programming disruptions that never come to pass and that could cause confusion and even prompt them to change cable providers unnecessarily. The report and order also makes clear that in situations where the change results from circumstances outside a cable operator's control, notice may be delivered using direct and reliable written means that can reach subscribers quickly, including on-screen notifications such as channel slates. The report and order also eliminates the requirement that cable operators subject to effective competition provide 30 days advance notice to local franchising authorities of rate or service changes and replaces it with a narrower requirement that applies only to rate-regulated cable operators. Specifically, rate-regulated cable operators must continue to provide local franchising authorities with 30 days advance notice of any proposed increase in the price to be charged for the basic service tier. The report and order also eliminates the requirement that cable operators provide notice of changes to the information required in certain annual notices. This information is available on the internet or not relevant to many consumers, and no commenter supported maintaining this requirement. Finally, the report and order adopts several non-substantive technical edits to eliminate duplicative requirements from the rules. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the report and order and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. We'll now turn to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In late January, I published a blog regarding additional media modernization ideas that the Commission should consider, including dispensing with certain record-keeping rules related to cable operator interests. At the time, we were blissfully ignorant of the kinds of transformative events that our country would experience over the last 6 to 7 months. Despite many challenges, the work of the Commission has continued throughout this period, and I commend the Chairman for continuing to push forward many reforms while handling the myriad of issues that have arisen due to COVID-19 pandemic, including rule changes to enable needed emergency programming. I hope we will consider adding to the list of needed reforms and expediting their adoption. When it comes to modernizing cable service change notifications, the item before us modifies these rules by balancing the need to inform consumers about certain changes with the burden imposed on providers and, in turn, their customers who ultimately bear these costs. The updated rules will have a measurable and positive effect in reducing the amount of resources that operators must put into certain notices and disclosures, many of which are left over from a bygone era and contain information that may be easily found on the internet. It is also important that some changes, such as the elimination of certain annual notices, rightfully shift the burden to the regulator to prove why a regulation must remain on the books rather than require regulated entities to constantly justify why outdated rules should be scrapped. The most substantial fix in the item alters when consumers must be notified of certain channel and programming changes. Over time, the existing FCC mandate has mistakenly been wrapped into certain retransmission consent disputes, and this item provides an even-handed remedy. Specifically, we alleviate the obligation that any change noticed notice be issued 30 days in advance, taking into account that some retransmission consent negotiations have been known to go down to the wire with respect to their contractual deadlines. To be clear, the retransmission consent process is not being changed in any way by this item, and cable operators will still be required to provide these notices as soon as possible. In the vein of reducing unnecessary requirements, we also voted in a separate item that was removed from today's agenda to dispense with the record-keeping rule for attributable interest that inexplicably outlasts the underlying mandate, which was struck down by the court nearly 2 decades ago. I thank my colleagues for their unanimous support for my efforts to advance this, and now that we move to this item that I will approve, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This decision we vote on today makes some common sense changes to our rules that didn't quite line up with practical reality. So I'm pleased to support it, and no separate statement from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll turn to Commissioner Rosenworcel.
You know, most consumers don't know anything about the term retransmission consent, but they do know the frustration of turning on their television to watch the big game, the local news, or their favorite show and only seeing a blank screen. When that happens, they know something is wrong, and the fact they can't watch isn't fair. They're right. And to prevent those problems and to keep consumers informed, the FCC has long had rules that require cable operators to tell their subscribers when carriage negotiations may go south. So 30 days in advance of retransmission consent negotiations that could fail, the cable operator is expected to disclose to its subscribers that an ongoing dispute might result in the loss of programming. And this approach has had its merits, but it also leads to consumers getting way more of these notices than necessary. And that can be confusing. That's because so many of these disputes are resolved before any channel even falls off the lineup and before any blank screens ensue. So today we update our rules for the real world. We determined that instead of a strict 30-day notice of a dispute that could lead to a loss of programming, it's just better if consumers are notified that a blackout may occur and that occurrence may happen as soon as possible. So this is a modern approach and it has my support. But one word of caution, this decision speaks at length about burdens on companies, but I believe the guiding principle here should be updating our policies for the benefit of consumers. In the end, I think the changes we make here do just that. But if they are put in practice in a way that shortchanges consumers, we will need to revisit this approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I noted at the NPRM stage, protecting consumers is a responsibility that I take very seriously. The impact on consumers' access to the services they pay for and in their pocketbooks can be significant if they don't receive adequate notice of failing contract negotiations that ultimately result in surprise service changes and television channel blackouts. I expressed that concern about modifying the notice requirement from 30 days in advance of contract expiration to as soon as possible, and stated that I would review the record closely to ensure that ultimately our decision put consumers first and front center. Commenters in the record describe how these negotiations can come down to the last days or even last hours before a contract is due, and that in most instances agreements are in fact reached and services disruptions are avoided. And when that happens, 30 days notice may cause unnecessary confusion, prompting some consumers to prematurely seek to switch providers only to find out that the negotiations were ultimately successful. In all, I will be watching to make sure that the changes we adopt today will, in fact, protect those consumers through notice provided as soon as possible. Thank you to the Media Bureau staff for their work on the item.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. Our action today marks the 25th order in our Modernization of Media Regulation initiative. And through this initiative, we've updated numerous rules to match the modern media marketplace and have eliminated others that have long since outlived their usefulness. Now, this particular report and order does both by modernizing a consumer notice rule to account for the current realities of carriage negotiations between cable operators and programmers, and repealing an unnecessary requirement concerning notices that cable operators must give to local franchising authorities. Now, these 25 media modernization orders would not have been possible without the dedicated work of dozens of commission staff from several offices. And so the silver anniversary in particular is attributable to the work of the great folks in the Media Bureau, who we've heard from, some of whom, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel. My thanks to you for your work on this and many other of the MMRI efforts. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approved.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for your patience and appreciate the work of the FCC staff in getting this back up and running. For the benefit of the public, we will record again the vote line for item number 5, which is modernizing cable service change notifications, Media Bureau docket number 19-347, modernization of media regulation initiative. We'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approved.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thank you all. And Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the 6th item is entitled Reforming IP Caption Telephone Service Rates and Service Standards. The item will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chief Weber, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau presents to you a report and order on reconsideration, and further notice of proposed rulemaking on caption telephone services supported by the Telecommunications Relay Services Fund. The item aligns fund compensation for caption providers with actual service costs and proposes rule changes to measure service quality. I would like to thank CGB staff for their hard work on this proceeding. I would also like to thank the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, the Office of the Managing Director, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Enforcement Bureau for their contributions to this item. Bob Aldridge, CGB's front office legal advisor, will present the item.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I'm pleased to present this report and order on reconsideration, and further notice of proposed rulemaking on captioned telephone services, which are forms of telecommunications relay service, or TRS. With these services, individuals with hearing loss can read captions of another person's spoken words on the telephone, enabling them to supplement their residual hearing and understand a telephone conversation. The report and order addresses TRS fund compensation for providers of the internet-based form of captioned telephone service, known as Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone Service, or IPCTS. To ensure that high-quality service is provided in the most efficient manner, the report and order would complete the phased adjustment of compensation rates for IPCTS begun in 2018 to bring TRS fund expenditures into line with the actual costs of providing the service. Specifically, the report and order would establish a cost-based target compensation rate of $1.30 per minute, based on providers' average historical and projected costs, plus a 10% operating margin. To allow time for higher cost providers to adopt more efficient methods and technologies, the compensation rate would transition from the current $1.58 level to the $1.30 level in a two-step process over 19 months. The $1.58 compensation rate previously established for the 2019-20 fund year was extended by the Bureau past its June 30th expiration date to allow the Commission to assess the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on provider costs. Based on the fund administrator's report that per minute costs have not increased due to COVID-19, the compensation rate would be reduced by 10% beginning December 1st, 2020 to $1.42 per minute for the remaining 7 months of the current TRS fund year. For the following fund year, beginning July 1st, 2021, the rate would be reduced further to reach the cost-based $1.30 level. The order on reconsideration would deny the petition of Sprint Corporation to reconsider the interim IPCTS compensation rates set by the Commission for the period from July 2018 to June 2020. For both IPCTS and its state-administered counterpart, Caption Telephone Service, the further notice of proposed rulemaking would propose the adoption of measurable standards of caption delay and caption accuracy. In addition, the further notice would propose guidelines for testing the performance of caption telephone services against quantitative standards and would seek comment on the appropriate entity to carry out such performance testing. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges for technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Eldridge, for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the voice service experiencing a resurgence in usage during the pandemic, it's no surprise that IPCTS program is seeing a similar response. For those paying attention, I've cautioned previously about the need to restore the program's sustainability and efficiency, and our current circumstances further validate the need for a viable and predictable solution rather than merely episodic attention based on the latest deadline or crisis. In this item, the Commission continues along the tired and worn path started in 2018 of ratcheting down IPCTS rates to align them with the actual cost of providing service. While the current methodology is an improvement over its predecessor, let's face reality. Rate regulation has failed to control costs or fix the program's underlying problems, and it perpetuates burdensome and complex processes for providers, the Commission, and the Telecommunications Relay Service Fund Administrator. Further, the Commission has a statutory duty to ensure that telecommunications relay services are available in most efficient manner, and that means spending only what is necessary to guarantee individuals access to functionally equivalent service. It's no secret that I'm an ardent proponent of reverse auctions to distribute federal subsidies as a means to approximating market conditions and maximizing efficiency, and would have preferred to take that approach for IPCTS. Fortunately, I'm in good company, as recent papers by Rosalind Leighton and the Free State Foundation have made the case for determining IPCTS compensation rates through reverse auctions. Sadly, we declined to pursue that approach today, delaying what should be inevitable. On a related note, some have accused the FCC of providing an unfair windfall to automatic speech recognition only providers due to the lower cost of providing that service. What would be truly unfair, however, not to mention statutorily prohibited, would be to ignore the principles of technology neutrality and promoting innovation. Providers using ASR must meet our minimum TSR standards, and as well as any IPCTS specific standards that must be adopted pursuant to the further notice. Moreover, it would be a mistake to discriminate against ASR, especially when its predominance is a question of when and not if. Technological progress, especially the use of free cutting-edge applications, is the best path to a more cost-efficient program. And this entire debate highlights yet another benefit of reverse auctions, rewarding innovation and efficiency rather than protecting legacy technology and stale incumbents. I certainly hope the in-depth work to develop a reverse auction will be pursued over the next 2 years. Nonetheless, I will support this item. Thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now turn to Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. I'll submit my written statement for the record to help catch us up a little bit.
Thank you, sir. I will now turn to Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Functional equivalency is such a clunky phrase, but as a concept, it has an elegant force. That's because it's the foundation for communications policy under the Americans with Disabilities Act. For more than 30 years, the policies that honor this phrase have made it possible for millions of Americans with hearing and speech impediments to have the right and ability to communicate, connect, and participate more fully in the world. Among the services that is designed to provide functional equivalency is what we talk about today, IPCTS. It allows those with some residual hearing to use their own voice to speak during a call, but then read captions on their device when the other participant in the call responds. That means people with hearing loss can do the things that so many of us take for granted: picking up the phone and seeking emergency help, securing a job, making a doctor's appointment, following up with a child's teacher, and keeping up with family and friends. It was 2 years ago when the FCC last updated its policies for IPCTS. And today, the agency continues this effort, reducing rates and proposing new service quality standards. But programs like IPCTS do not thrive without continuous review and care, so our attention here is warranted. But this decision today has some shortcomings. It goes on at length about reducing compensation and aligning services with costs, and this is important. But it is absolutely vital to remember, as I fear this does not, that the governing principle in the law here is functional equivalency. Likewise, it is problematic that we are still working on service quality standards for new IPCTS services well after making them eligible for funding. If functional equivalency is the legal requirement, logic suggests those standards should be in place before we even allow funds to flow. I hope going forward we fix these things. This program is absolutely critical for those who are hard of hearing and rely on it. That is especially true during this pandemic when IPCTS usage is clearly up. So I appreciate that my colleagues at Commissioner Stark's request agreed to extend many of our pandemic-related waivers for telecommunications relay services, including IPCTS. But because I think we have more to do to honor the law and spirit of functional equivalency, I choose to concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks. Commissioner, I believe you're muted.
Thank you. You figured I'd have that down by now. Not surprisingly, IPCTS providers disagree with the Commission's decision to resume the glide path toward a lower cost-based compensation rate, although they would have been on notice. Since 2018, that rates would be adjusted downward to better reflect the reasonable costs of providing telephone captioning service. We would have arrived here sooner had we not in March of this year suspended the glide path and held rates steady in light of uncertainty related to COVID-19 pandemic. I would have voted for an additional extension to keep the current compensation rate in place given the ongoing nature of the national emergency and the pandemic. And so I will concur in that aspect. And as to the other pandemic-related waivers specifically granted and extended 3 times, the release draft of this item would have reversed some of those pandemic-related waivers of speed of answer and certain other requirements under Section 64.604 and 64.606 of the Commission's rules without a determination that they will be longer needed because of pandemic conditions. And there are just, for me, too many unknowns to risk making compliance for providers harder or forcing providers out of business simply because they cannot comply with pre-pandemic service requirements. The challenges brought about by COVID-19 presumably will persist for as long as the pandemic continues to persist. And it therefore made little sense to me arbitrarily to eliminate those waivers as of November 30th, 2020. And so I appreciate the chairman agreeing to my request that we extend those waivers and direct the Bureau to consider further extensions so that the waivers remain in force until pandemic conditions improve. Finally, although we have already conditionally approved the use of fully automated IPCTS using automatic speech recognition, ASR technology, the jury is still out on how accurate and thus reliable the service is or will be. Commenters expressed concern about the use of ASR for important calls, which the accuracy is paramount, such as those involving medical diagnoses or emergency assistance. Moreover, in the same way that facial recognition programs using artificial intelligence and machine learning often exhibit deeply troubling biases for demographic groups defined by sex, age, and race, studies have shown that speech recognition services may be far more inclined to make errors when transcribing the speech of people of color than of their white counterparts. Thus, I share the concern of those who question whether ASR technology is fully ready for prime time to achieve the statutory mandate of functionally equivalent telephone service. We have not yet established these service quality standards or service-specific rates that reflect the current capabilities at lower cost. And so we must proceed cautiously but quickly towards establishing the appropriate service quality metrics and compensation rates for all captioned telephone service, including ASR-assisted IPCTS. Thank you to the Bureau for their hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll have a longer statement, which I will submit for the record, but suffice it to say here that I fully support the item appreciate the hard work of the staff in helping to prepare it. And in particular, I want to thank the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, the the Enforcement Bureau, and the Office of Managing Director. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve in part, concur in part.
Oh. I was just in the spirit of it. I'm concurring. Apologies.
Oh, thanks. No, we'll take it. That's fine.
All right. All right. Appreciate that. Sorry, I lost my stride when we got cut off there.
You were on a roll. You were on a roll. Like Seinfeld said, you said spike. So, all right, fine. Anyway, the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary. Sorry. This is item number 7, I believe it is. Okay. Yes, Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the last item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, last on your agenda, item 7 is an enforcement action for your consideration. The item will be presented by the Enforcement Bureau, and Rosemary Harold, Chief of the Bureau, will introduce the item.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Because this order is an enforcement-related matter, we are going to switch up the order slightly, as we have done in past cases involving the presentation of a forfeiture order at an open meeting. As with all open meeting items, the Bureau circulated this item to every commissioner at least 3 weeks ago. But there is, of course, a longstanding practice at the agency that we do not publicly disclose the target of an enforcement action unless and until the commission decides to take action. For this item, this means that the agency formally votes on the item, then here's a brief presentation from the Bureau before proceeding to any statements that the commissioners may have. This process ensures that the target will not be publicly disclosed until the FCC has voted to take action. Now, we're going to follow that precedent here. So now we will proceed directly to a vote on the item. Item 7 on the agenda, class number 200142. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted, as I anticipate will be requested by the Enforcement Bureau. And speaking of which, Chief Harold, it is to you we turn for presentation of the item.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Thank you very, very much for coming back to vote on today's item, a forfeiture order imposing a penalty of more than $49 million against Sandwich Isles Communications, Ayamana Enterprises, and Albert S.N. He for violating the Commission's universal service rules governing subsidies for service in high-cost areas. For their work on this item, I would like to thank my colleagues Keith Morgan, Deputy Chief of the Bureau, Rakesh Patel, Chief of the Bureau's Fraud Division, Mercedes Momani, Deputy Chief of the Fraud Division, and Megan Ingrasano, Investigative Counsel, who is with us in this virtual meeting. This forfeiture order is the culmination of an extensive investigation by USAC, the Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Enforcement Bureau, which led the Commission to issue a notice of apparent liability against Sandwich Isles in December 2016. Megan will now present the item.
Thank you, Rosemary. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. In this forfeiture order, the Commission imposes a forfeiture penalty of $49,598,448 against Sandwich Isles Communications for violations of the Commission's high-cost program rules. This is the full amount of the penalty proposed in the Commission's December 2016 Notice of Apparent Liability against Sandwich Isles. After fully considering all arguments raised in its response to the NAL, we find no reason to reduce the forfeiture penalty amount. We find Sandwich Isles' direct holding company, Waymana Enterprises, and its shareholder, Albert S.N. He, jointly and severally liable for the forfeiture penalty. Sandwich Isles is a Hawaii incumbent local exchange carrier serving the Hawaiian homelands, designated in 1997 as an eligible telecommunications carrier, and therefore able to obtain federal subsidies for providing service to people residing in certain high-cost areas. Following then sole shareholder Albert He's criminal tax fraud conviction in 2015, the Wireline Competition Bureau instructed USAC to conduct an investigation to determine whether Sandwich Isles had received improper payments from the federal high-cost program. USAC determined in its final 2016 report that Sandwich Isles had received more than $27 million in improper payments from the fund. Based on USAC's findings and investigation by the Enforcement Bureau, the Commission issued the NAL, finding Sandwich Isles apparently failed to keep its accounts, records, and memoranda in the manner prescribed by the Commission under its rules, in violation of Section 220 of the Communications Act. Specifically, the Commission found Sandwich Isles apparently misclassified its cable and wireline facilities costs, miscategorized personal expenses, and inflated management fees as business expenses, in violation of the Commission's Part 32 and Part 36 rules, which govern how rate of return carriers must classify their investments and expenses. We also found that Sandwich Isles apparently submitted and certified inaccurate data in its annual cost studies that were then used in the calculation of the company's high cost support for at least cost study years 2000 through 2013, in violation of the Commission's Part 69 rules. Each party, Sandwich Isles, Waimana, and HE, submitted its own response to the NAL. They argued that the Commission had interpreted and/or applied the high-cost rules incorrectly, that the proposed fine was excessive, and also submitted several procedural arguments. None of the parties advanced an inability to pay argument. In the forfeiture order, we address each of these arguments and find no basis to reduce or cancel the proposed forfeiture. As this action was brought under Section 220D of the Act, it is subject to a 5-year statute of limitations under Rule 1.80C2. We therefore calculated in the NAL a forfeiture based on violations within 5 years of the NAL's release, the violations based on cost study years 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013, and we calculated a per-day penalty based on Sandwich Isles' inaccurate cost studies. During the relevant period, this per-day penalty authorized was first $9,600, then adjusted to $11,362 per day. This per-day penalty adds up to a total forfeiture amount of $49,598,448 for cost study years 2010 through 2013. The Enforcement Bureau thanks you all for your votes today and does request editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Ingrisano, for that presentation, and to you, Chief Folks, and the entire Enforcement Bureau for your work on this item. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
No statement from me.
Okay. Commissioner Carr?
No statement from me either. Thanks. Thanks to the Bureau for their work.
All right. Commissioner Rosenworcel?
No statement here.
Commissioner Starks?
No statement from me. Thank you, as always, to the Enforcement Bureau for their stewardship of the fund. Thank you.
Terrific. I, too, will forego a statement, although I'll have a written one for the record. But I do want to say this has been a very long-running issue at the Commission. Dates back to my earliest days as a commissioner, when Chairman Janikowski first put an item on the on circulation. So I want to recognize all of the Enforcement Bureau staff and other staff across the agency for your dedication and focus on a very complicated matter. And you've resolved it, of course, as you've just seen, to the Commission's satisfaction, resulting in this forfeiture order. So thank you for that. We've already voted, so our work on that item is now done. Do any of my colleagues have any announcements that they would like to make at this time? Anybody? Okay, well, I'm sorry to prolong the meeting, but I do have a few announcements that are pretty important. First, I want to note the unfortunate passing of a few Commission employees who are very dear friends to many of us on this call, including me. Neil Deller, first, in the Office of General Counsel. Unfortunately, I have to share the sad news that Neil passed away suddenly and unexpectedly on September 3rd. And as you all know, Neil was not only an exceptionally gifted attorney and the Commission's go-to expert on all things corporate law, and somebody whose advice you ignored at your peril, but also just a really good human being. I had an office down the hall from him, and when I was in the Office of General Counsel, and I delighted in seeing him in the morning, and with his wry smile and a little bit of English wit, you just really start the day off on a high note. And he was like that for many, many other people throughout the agency, introducing them, new people to their new colleagues, and making everybody feel just great about working at the agency. Also, he was a Renaissance man, a great singer, also one of the carolers, for those of you familiar with the FCC tradition, both the writing and singing of it, which he was adept at, and also a food connoisseur. Loved opera, as I recently mentioned on Twitter, and just an all-around gentleman. He was a true family man who often spoke of his wife, Wendy, his son, Tristan, and his mother, Helen Diller, who was in England. So if you knew Neil, you also knew his family. They were rightfully proud of him, as are we, and we sent our heartfelt sympathy to all of them. He joined the commission 20 years ago after a career in private practice, and he just came to the FCC and has really been a mainstay of the transaction team in the Office of General Counsel, is one of the original members of that team, as a matter of fact. So we really want to, again, acknowledge Neil's contribution to the agency, his friendship to so many of us inside and outside of the commission, and our sympathy to his family. Godspeed and rest in peace, Neil. Next, Colleen Heitkamp. We were also saddened to learn of the passing of Colleen, our former and beloved colleague. She came to the commission in the early 1990s as a staff attorney in the Common Carrier Bureau's Enforcement Division. She grew up on a farm in Iowa, a good Midwestern citizen, and graduated from law school at the University of Maryland after spending a few years in California with a stint at Cat Fancy magazine, a fact that you don't often forget, to say the least. She was president of the creation of the Enforcement Bureau in 1999, so it's fitting that Ms. Ingressano and Ms. Harold are presenting the last item. She served for a number of years as the chief of the Telecommunications Consumer Division within EB. She then moved to the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau in 2010, where she was the chief of the Consumer Policy Division. She served later in the Office of Inspector General before retiring in 2012. She was really loved and popular among all those that she supervised and interacted with, and she'll be remembered as well for her empathy, her encouragement, her leadership, dry wit, and for all of those that she helped throughout her career. Rest in peace, Colleen, and thank you for your service to the commission. Next, Kate Collins. We are here to also recognize the outstanding work of an International Bureau employee on this on these issues that we've been discussing today, like Team Telecom. She's now been serving 40 years at the commission. The vast majority of that time, with the FCC, for almost the vast majority of that time with the commission. In fact, she joined the FCC on September 7th, 1980, and worked in various offices, including the old Common Carrier Bureau, before joining the Office of International Communications and then moving to the IB when it was created in 1994. She's done a lot of great work in various offices within IB, including her current role as an assistant bureau chief, who's overseeing the bureau's efforts on things like the Team Telecom item. Thank you and congratulations, Kate, on achieving this milestone. We're grateful for your service and look forward to the next 40 years of your service to the International Bureau. Next, Axel Rodriguez. I am really happy to welcome Axel back to the commission. He had been serving on a detail to the U.S. Army, where he was working on a variety of defense communications issues. Before that, he was working with the Office of Engineering and Technology. He was supervising our equipment authorization program at OET's lab up in Columbia, which, of course, as you know, ensures that equipment marketed within the U.S. complies with the FCC's regulations. He's now going to be the director of the Enforcement Bureau's field offices. Field offices, of course, the beating heart, the eyes, if you will, the cop on the beat across the country in our various offices. And Axel is going to be supervising those important operations and, of course, liaising back with Chief Harold and all of us. So, Axel, you're the right man for the job at the right time. We're really glad you're back with us, and welcome aboard in this new role. Last but not least, I want to recognize one of the best parts of the commission proceedings each and every year, which is the winners of the FCC's 2020 Excellence in Economic Analysis and Excellence in Engineering Awards. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Academy Awards, the show, that is, you probably know that Hollywood each year hosts a scientific and technical awards event where they recognize people who've contributed to the making of movies. And during the Oscar show, they play a video that describes this event. Well, this is much cooler than that. We've actually got a video that describes our own awardees for the 2020 Excellence in Economic Analysis and Excellence in Engineering Award. They've done some incredible work at the commission, as you will see. And here is a video of that gathering that the Office of Media Relations helped us put together. What an honor it is to announce the winners of the Federal Communications Commission's 2020 Excellence in Economic Analysis and Excellence in Engineering Awards. The Excellence in Economic Analysis Award recognizes commission staff for outstanding economic analysis conducted in the course of their work at the FCC. And the Excellence in Engineering Award recognizes commission staff who have made outstanding engineering, scientific, or technical contributions to the agency's work. The outstanding work of the FCC's dedicated team of public servants is the lifeblood of the agency's operations and a key contributor to our success. And that is especially the case with our 6 standout awardees, who contributed their economic and engineering expertise to help us fulfill our responsibilities to the American people. I'll start with the 2020 Excellence in Economic Analysis Award. That award goes to Nicholas Copeland, Paul LaFontaine, Sean Sullivan, and Patrick Sun of the Office of Economics and Analytics. Nick, Paul, Sean, and Patrick are sharing this award for their development of the 3 economic models used to determine the 5G Fund, a new program the FCC has proposed to distribute up to $9 billion for next-generation wireless broadband connectivity in rural America, adjustment factor values. Their work estimates the relative costs of providing services across areas with differing terrain characteristics and business cases based on carriers' own entry, infrastructure deployment, and bidding decision. That work is essential to helping us close the mobile digital divide, and it shows why we have put a premium on economic analysis as a factor in the Commission's decision-making. My hearty congratulations to Nick, Paul, Sean, and Patrick for your contributions. And with that, I will turn it over to the Distinguished Chief of the Office of Economics and Analytics, Ms. Julia McHenry, for any comments she might wish to make.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. It is truly an honor to be able to thank and congratulate Nick Copeland, Paul LaFontaine, Sean Sullivan, and Patrick Sun. Their work related to the 5G Fund to develop 3 economic models is exemplary of the type of economic analysis we've come to expect at the Commission. I am so grateful for their hard work on this item and so many more that they perform on a daily basis. We really appreciate their hard work and contribution to the 5G Fund. Thank you and congratulations, Nick, Paul, Sean, and Patrick. Chairman?
Well, thanks so much, Chief McHenry. Really appreciate it, and congratulations again to our economics awardees. With that, we will turn to the Excellence in Engineering Awards. This award for 2020 is shared by Melvin Del Rosario and Christopher Miller from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for their innovative work creating a simple, user-friendly, web-based mapping tool for applicants in the Commission's 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal priority window. Their efforts made it easier for tribal entities to apply for long fallow spectrum in the 2.5 gigahertz band, which will help us close the digital divide on rural tribal lands. Now, this tribal priority window has been a first of its kind effort to help connect tribal communities through access to mid-band spectrum. And the vital aspect of this effort has been matching the availability of spectrum, which is something the FCC is doing, with those tribal entities that desperately need that spectrum in order to deliver what we call digital opportunity to those who have for too long been on the wrong side of the digital divide. I want to thank Melvin and Chris for their incredible work, and to help salute them, I will turn it over to the Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology, Mr. Ron Rapazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an equal pleasure of mine to offer, and an honor to offer, the 2020 Excellence in Engineering Award to Melvin and to Chris this year. The EIE is a very competitive arena, and it's no surprise by the nominations we've received this year. Melvin and Chris's work in the 2.5 gigahertz band is the excellence in engineering at the FCC that we all greatly appreciate. With that, I congratulate you both and appreciate all the work that you've committed to for the Commission. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. And just to put a pin on it, I also, once again, want to congratulate all of the winners for the Excellence in Economics and Excellence in Engineering Awards to Nick, Paul, Sean, Patrick, Melvin, and Chris. You represent the very best in public service, and we are exceptionally glad and exceptionally grateful that you have chosen to lend your expertise to the Commission on these critical initiatives at this critical time. Thanks so much, and congratulations again. Well, great. Notwithstanding the 5 o'clock shadow and the tan jacket after Labor Day, I hope folks will recognize that we wanted to salute those excellent public servants. So thanks to all the winners for the work that they have done. With that, Madam Secretary, I'll turn to you to give us the date of the next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission.
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Tuesday, October 27th, 2020.
All right, with that, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.